Pallavi, thank you so much for joining us on ITV Gold. I hope you're doing well in Georgia.
I am. I hope you are too.
Yes, of course. Pallavi, starting this interview, I have to ask you, you're in a state that has reopened to a level that we didn't expect a state to reopen during this coronavirus pandemic. We're talking about everything from salons to tattoo parlors to restaurants, mall, bowling alleys open in the state of Georgia. I have to ask you, how are you feeling about this? And as a political, person who's really, really, into the system, how are you looking at this reopening and its impact on the state itself?
I don't feel good about it. A lot of our mayors have come out and said that they're concerned. Atlanta Mayor Keisha Lance Bottoms has come out and said she's concerned. What really concerns me is that Governor Brian Kemp, it seems like he made the decision kind of unilaterally. His own coronavirus task force did not know that he was going to open the state up until the press conference happened. And that's where it gives me pause, because it tells me that he's not listening to experts. He's maybe making a political decision. And in a state where, we have a lot of deaths already, it's simply not, it's a rash decision that I don't feel good about.
Do you think this is going to lead into an increase in cases and, deaths, unfortunately, due to that?
I mean, it's hard to tell because realistically, yeah, because there are people who are going out to salons, they're going to tattoo parlors. These are places you really cannot social distance, and it just leads to the spread of a virus where we don't know a whole lot about this virus. We know it's very contagious, but we've pretty much taken away any kind of the constraints to make sure that we have ways to deal with it, just because it seems, again, like a political economic decision. And yeah, I am afraid that it's going to get worse.
And what do you have to say about the other leadership of Georgia? We spoke to State Representative Kosh, who also had a lot of concerns in regards to this reopening, in regards to the rising cases, and her own experience of COVID was also very current. What do you have to say about the rest of the leadership, the ones that you're interacting with?
It seems a little bit on partisan lines. Angelica Couch is my representative. I know the House Democratic Caucus is really pushing for just better rules and more restraints. The House Democratic Caucus is also pushing for expansion of Medicaid, because we think that's something that's going to help people deal with something like a pandemic. But I am seeing, some Republicans kind of caution the governor. And at the end of the day, a death is a death. We're in the thousands with Georgia deaths, and the virus doesn't pick and choose whether it's a Democrat or Republican or somebody who's not interested in politics. I am seeing a little bit of bipartisan support, but for the optics of it, especially this being an election year, it seems like a very partisan conversation going on right now.
What do you have to say about the economic ramifications that you've seen of COVID-19 on Georgia? And, I have to ask, do you think this reopening would truly help the economy if we're already concerned about a spike in cases?
It wouldn't. At the end of the day, I think the governor made a decision because we are getting very close to just kind of being done with our economic funds. There are so many unemployed people, and a lot of people are asking for unemployed benefits. There's PPP funds that need to go out, and I think the governor is kind of looking at those funds and seeing that they're, getting released to the public maybe a little faster than he anticipated, and to kind of, block that hemorrhage, he went ahead and made this decision. I think it's short-sighted. I think in the long run, if more people are unhealthy, it affects the economy even worse. But I really feel like that's an election year decision he made.
Yeah, definitely. And in terms of hospital capacity, Pallavi, do you know if Georgia hospitals are currently ready for a resurge or an increase of cases in terms of PPE supplies to other facilities that they need? Is it being given to them? Are there enough resources available for them?
I think it depends a little bit on the area. I live in Johns Creek, which is fairly affluent, and the hospitals here are doing a little bit better. There was an NPR report that came out, I believe it was yesterday, saying, Georgia hospitals are probably not ready to deal with the second surge. A lot of our ICU units and our hospital units are near the 65-70% capacity, and experts are saying, especially with the CDC being right here in Atlanta, there's the experts are saying that the hospitals just simply might not be ready.
Oh wow! So what happens then?
That's honestly, that's for the governor to kind of come out and say, if there is a second surge, what do we do about it? Which is why I feel that decision is so short-sighted, because I don't think he's really taken into account just what happens when hospitals are at capacity and people are getting sick left and right. And I think it would be important for once the Georgia Capitol, once they convene back, I believe it's June 11th, to kind of for everybody to get together, the state house representatives and senators to commit together and decide what happens next.
Pallavi, the economic crisis and the healthcare crisis, since we are coming to you from New York City, we've seen a first-hand experience of how they're going hand in hand right now. What, according to you, is needed at the state level in Georgia right now, and maybe perhaps at the federal level for the state of Georgia, in order to really sort of balance out this economic crisis with the healthcare crisis?
Well, part of it starts with leading with science and really, relying on what the experts are saying. When you have scientists and people at the CDC and people at the WHO saying things like it's too early to open, and we have Dr. Fauci who's constantly saying some states are reopening too early. I think it's almost delusional to come out and say we will ignore all of the science, we will ignore all the risks that come with reopening and just focus on the economy, because at the end of the day, the economy doesn't exist in a silo. It's the people that drive the economy, and if you're not taking care to make sure that the people are healthy, and this isn't the flu, this isn't something I've seen this being compared to car accidents and drownings. This is something that's very contagious, and it's affecting Black and brown populations more. It's affecting seniors more. We're now seeing that, people under the age of 40 are getting affected, maybe not as badly, but, they're still part of the economy. And I think part of it starts with when you put people first, it's a better way to take care of the economy, because that's who drives the economy. When you kind of look at the business bottom line and how much, what's going into the pockets of CEOs without taking care of the workers, I think it's just a bad foundation, because going forward, we're going to see those same workers who businesses depend on not be able to be part of the workforce.
You just highlighted on racial disparity, Pallavi, and this is something that I really would like to sort of discuss a little bit more, because racial disparity has been an issue in the state of Georgia in general. For ages, we've talked about it. But also, we've seen this racial disparity be visible throughout the country during this crisis. What do you have to say about that impact on the state of Georgia? And when you're looking at the South Asian American population, are they particularly getting impacted by this as well?
So one of the things that I'm concerned with, not just with Georgia, but nationally, is we have some states who are taking in data that include race. I believe, from what I know, Georgia is not among them. So it's very hard to look at the numbers and actually see, what's the South Asian population looking like? Is there anything that jumps off from the charts? But we have seen areas where there's a concentration of Black and brown populations, especially for not so affluent areas, that are getting hit the hardest. So we need to make sure that those racial disparities, regardless of whether it's a pandemic or just regular healthcare concerns, I think Georgia's really lagged behind on making sure that some of the populations that are vulnerable get the help that they need. And part of it is starting with Medicaid expansion, because if we were to expand Medicaid, I think about 500,000 Georgians who currently don't have insurance would be covered. But the racial disparity conversation is just so much larger than this pandemic. And part of it is a lot of the Black and brown populations are the workers, or the essential workers that go into the grocery stores and are being exposed, that have these nail salons and tattoo parlors. So it's a population it's the working class that's being exposed to the virus, and it's also a population that doesn't have access to proper health care. And this is just a much broader conversation that doesn't begin or end with this pandemic.
Pallavi, what resources are there for these populations, perhaps in the district that you're coming from, Johns Creek? There's a lot of South Asian population there and other minorities as well. What kind of resources have you seen for them?
So some of the resources that I'm seeing that are coming out has really been from the community. So there were hospitals that were asking for masks. There were police departments that maybe didn't have all the protection that they needed. And I've seen especially the East Asian community, the South Asian community really come together and bring the masks and hand sanitizers to these organizations that really should be taking, these are government organizations, and they're kind of filling a gap that the government is not. I've seen some improvement on small business loans, but that's still something that people just have to stay on and make sure that they're reaching out to their state representatives and senators and letting them know what's going on, so that from the legislative level there's a push.
I want to discuss with you the political aspect of what's happening with this pandemic just in a little bit. But right before that, I want to reflect upon the frontline workers here. The EMS workers, all of the healthcare workers, medical professionals, they're really, putting their lives at risk. What kind of resources are available there in Georgia for all of these workers? As well as what are their challenges right now that they're facing that, perhaps the state needs to help them with?
Right. So a lot of it, like I said, the community is filling a gap that the state is kind of leaving wide open. There are a lot of essential workers, whether it's healthcare, whether it's groceries or people with waste management, that simply don't have access to these to just protective gear, just something as simple as a mask. And we're seeing states kind of fend for themselves because of federal level. I genuinely believe there's a lack of leadership, and now a lot of states, it really depends on whether the governor and the state leadership is kind of, filling the cracks of these leadership, of the federal leadership. So we're definitely seeing healthcare workers just not have access to things. But I'm happy that some of the community is coming together to help it out. But again, it's a gap that, it's the government just kind of not doing their job at this point.
Well, Olivia, policy and politics are kind of like the heart of this crisis right now, because it is literally all about that. I kind of wanted to take our conversation towards perhaps political education of what we should understand about what's happening here and where our voice really should come out. How should we advocate for ourselves? According to you, where is our role and responsibility and our civic duty currently with this pandemic going on?
Yeah, I think a lot of times, there are people who tell me their politics is not their thing. And it really confuses me because, when something like this comes along, it really brings to people's attention that politics is personal. We have a state Senate, we have a state House of Representatives, and these are people who make laws on a local level. So something like Medicaid expansion or access to healthcare, something like having proper schools in districts and having good funding for them. These are all decided on the state level, but sadly, these are the races that really get ignored because they're not the big races where people constantly see the candidates on TV. But it's really important for people, especially, and I'm specifically talking to the South Asian community because we lack voter turnout a little bit compared to other demographics. It's really up to us to not only vote every 2 years or every time there's an election, but also keep our representatives accountable. A lot of people watching might not know who their state senator or state representative is, and that's okay. But, something like this should tell us that that kind of culture needs to change. We need to not only put the best people in office, but once we do have a state representative, once we do have a state senator, something as simple as finding them on Facebook, finding their page on Facebook and liking it, and making sure that they're giving you the information that you need. It's really important, and I can't stress that enough. The deadline for registration in the primary in Georgia just passed, but there's still time to register to vote in the November election, and people will be voting from, whether they'll be voting on their U.S. senator, they'll be voting for their county commissioners, they will be voting for their state representatives and senators. And these are the people who make laws that affect people's day-to-day lives. And it's really crucial that people start paying attention to politics, because at the end of the day, every law that gets passed whether you like it or not, whether you're aware of it or not, will affect your daily lives.
Definitely. Let's talk about this primary election a little bit. It got moved to the month of June.
Yes.
However, it is really important that people know how the votes are going to be done, as
Right.
well as the importance of voting. So let's just talk a little bit about what's happening in Georgia. What are some of the key topics that are, of importance for this particular election, according to you? And, if you wanted to educate the audience, especially the ones that are joining us from Georgia, what should they reflect upon when they're casting their vote, especially in this cycle, and then again in November?
Right. So think about healthcare is going to be a big one, whether this pandemic happened or not. We saw it in the 2018 election. We saw it in the 2016 election. Education is always going to be a big thing. The area that we live in, a lot of people move in here and pay the high property taxes just so that their children can go to better schools. I on principle, I don't like the fact that good schools are tied to zip codes, and the fact that you can afford a higher property tax shouldn't mean that that's the only way to access a good school. But these are all issues that your state level legislators will make. And then on, the governor isn't up for re-election, but these are things that are important to think about, right? So in the last election, Governor Kemp won by, I believe it was less than 2%. But if you look at his leadership, if you look at the fact that there's just so much gray area and so much confusion in the way that he's leading, his own task force is coming out and saying, well, we didn't know he was going to open the state. He recently got some pushback because he decided that teenagers to get their licenses wouldn't have to take the road test anymore. And as long as their parents were signing off saying, they did the amount, a certain amount of driving with the parents, they were allowed to get a license. And that's not an individual, it's not something that just affects that family, it affects everybody on the road. And after there was backlash, after about 20,000 teenagers got their licenses, he came out and reversed that and said they do now have to take the road test, and that has to be done by September 30th. So a lot of decisions are being made by his leadership, by his administration, where it almost feels like buyer's remorse, where he'll come out and say something to appease the crowd, and then there'll be a lot of pushback that he's not anticipating, and then he comes back and reverses it and causes even more confusion. Brian Kemp's approval rating is now in the 30s. About almost 70% of the Georgians who were polled in a specific poll said that the state is opening up too early. So you can see that these are not partisan. This is not a Democrat versus Republican conversation anymore. But all of this can be avoided if people pay attention to state politics. I really wish Stacey Abrams were governor right now, because I think we would have just a better handle on the way things are going. But for changes like that to happen on the state level, people need to pay attention to state level politics.
For sure, and they have to cast their vote,
Yes.
Advocate their voice, which is extremely important right now. Do you have any idea about what is going to be the future of elections for us? Will these be mail-in ballots? Will these be, will we be going to a location to cast vote? What are you hearing, at least in terms of this primary that's coming up in June in Georgia?
The primary did get moved about 5 weeks, and that itself is causing a lot of confusion. The Secretary of State here decided to send out ballot request forms to all active voters. And some counties are doing great. The county that I live in, Fulton County, is the most populous in the state, and there's a huge lag. I sent in my ballot request about 5 weeks ago, and I still haven't received anything. I haven't even received confirmation that they've received my ballot request. I sent my mom's in about 5 minutes after mine, and she got hers approved about 2 weeks ago. So we're seeing a lot, because the elections are being done on the county level. We're seeing some counties do really well, and those are usually the counties with better resources and less of a population. But then you see something like Fulton County, where there's a lot more people, and they're really struggling to keep up with this. So I would love for there to be a better vote by mail system, but that comes with having resources, right? We can't take away half the staff. We can't reduce their funding and then say perform at the same level that you have always been. So I would like to see better resources given. I would like to see better laws in place. I'd like to see same-day registration. I'd like to see automatic registration for people when they turn 18. I think Georgia makes voting a little bit harder depending on where you live. The one thing I will say is for Georgians watching, the law is that there has to be at least 3 weeks of early voting in person. So you do have the option to go vote in person. But I would really stress to try to do it by mail, just because we're at such a confused time where we don't know if the virus is going to be leaving us anytime soon. But at the same time, if you don't get your ballot in the mail even after you requested it, if possible, and if it's safe for you to do so, I do encourage you to go vote in person.
What do you see as voter participation and the importance of it for the November election? And what do you think is at stake right now in terms of looking at the November election? And how important is it, again, for all of us to vote?
I cannot stress this enough. It's so important to go out and vote in November. We're seeing a massive surge in the people who are requesting ballots. In some areas, I'm working on 4 races. On one of them, some of the precincts are reporting about 165% increase from the 2018 election. We were expecting a little bit of a surge because in presidential elections, there is a little bit higher turnout. But the numbers we're seeing, it's amazing. It's showing us that people have really tuned in, and they're now realizing that politics affects their day-to-day lives. So it's incredibly important. We have, I think, part of the reason we're in this predicament is because our national leadership has really let us down. We have a CDC that's, has not been receiving the same funding that it did before. We've had all these programs that were specifically designed to deal with pandemics be gutted, by whether it's through money or through staff. And we need that leadership on the national level to tell us that, regardless of what happens, we can trust that leadership. We can trust the numbers coming out of them. We can trust the policies coming out of them. But we also need a really strong state leadership, because it's the local laws that affect people the most. And coming up in November, people are going to be voting for their senators. So that's a federal level race. People are going to be voting for their U.S. Congressmen, and that's going to be a federal level. They're also going to be voting for everything down to their county level. And again, it's so important for people to not only know who they're going to vote for these federal races, but look at page 3 and page 4 of your ballot. Those are extremely important races as well. They're just not races that are going to get a lot of national attention, because not everybody knows who's running for county commissioner, but you should know who's running for your county commissioner and what they're going to do for you.
I think that was a really good tip you gave for our audience there, which is, to know what's happening on your local and state level and to go out and vote. We're coming towards the end of this interview. I have a few questions left for you. Mm-hmm. My first question would be, looking at so many issues that are happening right now, especially for politicians and people that are in politics, such as yourself, what is your, focus the next couple of weeks? What are some topics that definitely need more attention from all politicians?
My focus has been to increase voter turnout and to increase just voter education. A lot of times people, I stress the importance of voting, but I'm also really cognizant of the fact that Georgia doesn't make it very easy to vote, and we also make it very confusing to vote. We have judges who we're going to be voting for, and it's very hard to really do a whole lot of research into, a judge or a sheriff. And those are all elected positions. DAs are all elected positions. Georgia has recently been in the news for this horrible lynching that happened down in Brunswick, Georgia. Mr. Arbery, who was supposed to turn 26 this month, was really hunted down by 2 men and killed for the color of his skin. And as the case is unfolding, we're seeing just how badly the DAs messed up and how much they decided to coddle the victims, in a sense, the perpetrators in a sense. And it's so important to vote for the right district attorneys, because that's what keeps situations from these happening and getting worse. So I'm really going to stress, making sure that you're voting for every single person that's going to show up on your ballot. And that's a good thing about voting by mail, right? Because you're going to get your ballot at home, and you get to look at your ballot and do your research and hold on to it for a few days and make the right decision and then send it back, compared to when you go vote in person, you have a few minutes to do it. So that's one of the reasons I'm really stressing these down ballot races, because they don't, and I know I've said it a few times now, they don't sound as important, but they're really critical to day-to-day life.
Pallavi, this was great having you here on ITV Gold with us. Now, one last question would be a message out to the audience, not just on voter education, but perhaps what they should think about in the next couple of weeks while they see the administration, CDC, everyone come and comment on the coronavirus pandemic, talk about economy. How should we sort of kind of understand this?
Right. I've seen a lot of people come out and just say, let's just stay at home until this blows over. And I understand for a lot of people, that's simply not a possibility. If you have a family you have to feed, and you have a small business, you need to go out and make money, and you need to go out and have a way to pay your bills. So I definitely feel for people who are in this just horrible predicament, because, something that we should have dealt with better and we should have prepared for better just simply didn't happen. But I encourage people to reach out to the authorities, to just any organizations that are there locally that are meant to kind of alleviate a little bit of the pain. I encourage people to be brave enough to be humble. I think within a lot of South Asian communities, we tend to not give a whole lot of weight to, when things are going bad. So whether it's asking for help, whether, financially, maybe going to a food pantry, just doing the right things to make sure that you're making this better for yourself. I think it's important for us to look out for each other. Here, we've seen this around the world. Cases of abuse, cases of domestic violence have gone up because a lot of times leaving for work is a way to get away from bad situations. And now, because of isolation, a lot of people can't do that. We've seen mental health just get worse because there's so many things people are dealing with. So I encourage people to just be there for one another. There are things that I wish the government was doing better, and they're not. But that's definitely something that we can at least try to make better by just being part of a community that steps up. And I encourage people to make sure you know who's running in your county, in your state, in every level of government, because whether you go vote in November or not, the people who get elected will run your lives, and it's really up to you to decide if you want a say in that. And then reach out to organizations that make, kind of take away the suspense and the tension from voting. And if it's something that you've never done before, reach out to a few people who have, and just, make sure that you feel comfortable with the whole process of voting. Because at the end of the day, I can't stress this enough, it matters who gets elected in November.